Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at the Canadian Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce's 2020 Digital LGBT Global Business Summit. My name is Rupert Hahn. I'm the Regional Manager of LGBTQ2+ Business Development, supporting the Greater Toronto Area at TD Bank Group. Proud sponsor of the summit and this next session. First off, I'd like to congratulate Daryl and his team for putting on the event. Due to COVID-19, a lot of hard work and planning took place to move the summit from a live event into one that is virtual. At TD, supporting diversity and inclusion is business imperative. It's not simply just an HR initiative. This makes excellent business sense in serving our customers and in attracting the best and brightest talent. TD has a long history in partnering with the Canadian Gay Lesbian Chamber of Commerce. And by being a sponsor of this week's summit, this is just another way to show our great relationship that we have together. TD's support of the LGBTQ2+ community across our footprint in North America is not a fluke or a one-off. It is a strategic bold move on our part from the get-go. In fact, in 1994, TD was the first bank to introduce same-sex benefits in the Canadian workplace. And in 2005, TD again was the first bank to sponsor a major pride festival here in Canada, and that was right here in Toronto. And I'm proud to say that my role as Regional Manager of LGBTQ2+ Business Development, it's truly the first of its kind in North America and within the financial services industry. In addition to myself, we have a number of regional managers spread across the country. I'm not saying these things to be boastful, but this is just to show how deeply committed we are in our community. Although our initiative with the Chamber is supporting the Supplier Diversity Program, we also do much more year-round. Last year, we partnered with Nielsen to conduct a national LGBT business landscape study, which you're going to hear more about it tomorrow. And we recently participated in one of the Chamber's weekly COVID-19 business stakeholders call, where we provided details on how TD is stepping up to support small business owners during these difficult times. We're always looking for ways to help the Chamber to add more value to its members. And before I close, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that June is Pride Month. Although the celebration will look a little bit different this year due to the pandemic, however, you will still see an explosion of rainbow and sparkles around many of our cities across Canada. At TD, we strongly believe in supporting the community 365 days of the year. We were here before June, we will be here to celebrate with you during Pride Month, and we will continue to engage with you after Pride Month is over, which aligns with our motto, Forever Proud. And now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our next session, What's Going On with the Economy, presented by Andrea Gardella, Senior Economist with Export Development Canada. Thank you and enjoy the session.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CGLCC Global Business Summit and Happy Pride. Ma présentation sera en anglais, mais je vous invite et vous encourage de demander vos questions dans la langue de votre choix. I am honored to be one of your first speakers. My name is Andrea Gardella, and I'm coming to you from Ottawa, representing Export Development Canada. And so as a very quick introduction about Export Development Canada, we are Canada's credit agency, export credit agency, serving Canadian companies doing business internationally. We offer financial insurance and knowledge products to support Canadian businesses go, grow, and succeed abroad. Our economics department is at the center of many parts of EDC's business, including providing advisory services through strategic initiatives, and importantly, supporting our partners and our customers. We do business in over 200 markets, and doing business abroad, like any business, is quite risky and can be risky. And we're here to support companies through that uncertainty. And that includes navigating the sea of information and data out there and weaving it together to hopefully support Canadian businesses. And so to kick off what I expect to be a highly engaging and informative summit, I'll be exploring three important questions throughout my presentation in order to contextualize the unprecedented times that we are living through. First, I'll start with a very quick outline of where we were leading up to March 11th, the day that the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a pandemic. I will follow with EDC's views on what has happened since and close with what we can expect moving forward. A caveat before we move forward is that forecasting the global outlook in these unprecedented times has been challenging, and we will be in a perpetual forecast period for months to come. And as data comes in and showing the speed and breadth of downward change in the global economy, but we know enough to guide us in the right direction. So there were plenty of ups and downs throughout the world in 2019, from Brexit to the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, or CUSMA, negotiations, to the US-China trade dispute and fears of a recession. This did make for a bumpy voyage into 2020. As we began the year, however, there were some green shoots. You have CUSMA on its way to being ratified, Brexit had been passed, and the world's two main superpowers had signed phase one of a trade deal. And so life seemed relatively stable, but with a lot less attention, a virus outbreak was spreading quickly in one of the most important global economic engines, and that is China. By March 3rd, it became evident that we had a global health crisis spreading, and the US Federal Reserve was the first to act, reversing its interest rate hikes, and we once again entered a period of low interest rates. And since March 11th, the announcements have not stopped. In Canada, we were facing some challenges entering the crisis. We had low consumer savings, high debt to income that was fueling a cross-country housing bubble. Investment and trade were faltering due to the perceived uncertainty and in future global trade global trade rules, and the US-China trade dispute and Brexit still left some feelings of uncertainty out there, and despite the movements towards clarity and resolution. So our higher trade dependence made us especially vulnerable to the virus-related disruptions to international trade. Now, as of June 1st, there have been 6.2 million reported cases. At this point, very few countries have been spared. We had phase one that saw a swift rise in cases starting in China. Phase two was the spread to Western Europe and specifically Italy and Spain, sparking sweeping travel restrictions that have and will continue to have significant effects on the global economy. We had phase three with the United States topping the ranking for the number of cases. And phase four has been the rapid escalation in other emerging markets such as Brazil, Russia, and India. The speed at which this pandemic has spread throughout the world has caught policymakers off guard, and concerns of overburdening our health systems quickly led to social isolation, social distancing directives, and in some cases, severe lockdowns. Now, the economy became the next biggest concern. Demand was going to decline. It was inevitable. But what made this crisis different from others, such as the global financial crisis, is that it was also hit by a simultaneous supply shock. And so most data is lagged, but we can leverage certain indicators to show closer to real time what has and is happening in the economy. Some indicators are leading and can provide a view of how consumers and businesses are behaving and intend to behave moving forward. When confidence is high, we are more likely to invest and to spend. When it falls, this is where economists start to worry about the future for both. And during COVID-19, confidence indicators very quickly turned pessimistic. And for businesses, this pessimism outran the 2008-2009 numbers we saw during the global financial crisis. It is no surprise, lockdowns and temporary closures directly affect business investment decisions. And when confidence falls, markets usually follow. And so markets are increasingly serving as a central source of funding for businesses and governments. And we saw the stock markets plunge, as well as a very swift increase in the cost of higher risk and emerging market debt throughout this period. And spreads in terms of debt spreads for governments, spreads in the 4 digits were no longer reserved for markets like Venezuela. And so many markets started entering the higher risk bracket from a global perspective. In March, we saw financial outflows double those in 2008, 2009. And so there were starting to be concerns about liquidity and what we can expect for liquidity and markets moving forward. Now, the economy was hit by a perfect storm. So above and beyond COVID-19, we also had an oil price shock. And so as indicators of demand, as an indicator of demand and of economic activity, the oil price drop exacerbated the already challenging outlook we were facing. So the OPEC plus agreement fell apart, resulting in a price war that significantly curtailed shipments, orders, and investment. And oil producers scrambled to find storage as demand plummeted, leading to negative prices some weeks ago or months ago. And while prices were largely influenced by a supply glut and a price war, the demand for fuel, particularly for air travel, is going to be an ongoing sore point for the energy industry. Air travel is one of the largest consumers of oil, and with flights declining by 75% at its height, and little hope that we'll be back to normal anytime soon, the oil industry, the oil and gas industry will face some challenges as well. And looking at orders, they are telling a very similar story, but there are some reasons for optimism. So in conjunction with the drop in demand, social restrictions and lockdowns, purchasing managers, so that is purchasing into supply chains, into production, we saw a very little expansion happening in March and April. And so while that is leading to some pessimistic outlook, we are seeing some signs of optimism as the reopening of China and the stable expansion occurring as the country starts to lift its lockdown. And so China is about 6 weeks ahead of us, and we start to see some improvements in May or June, as we can see, particularly those boxes that are outlined going into April, that China is starting to increase its orders, which ultimately trickles down into the rest of our economy. So the speed at which capacity can ramp up and whether the demand for final goods will be back to pre-COVID levels is another question entirely, unfortunately. And so now that we've covered the big picture of COVID-19 and the impacts it has had on markets and on business decisions, let's take a quick look at what is driving and reducing demand. So in terms of consumer spending, the more discretionary, the more it is going to be impacted during this period. Almost 60% of our spending in 2019 was on staples, which leaves about 40% of our past spending habits going into more discretionary or delayable purchases. Importantly, industries related to the arts, entertainment, particularly those linked to the food services industry, and travel will make up a large proportion of that spending and will be one of the hardest hits. And so if we're looking at Q1 data and consumer spending within that period, where we should start to see COVID-19 changes in consumer behavior, as March was one of the more important months for that data, we note that food, hobbies, home-related entertainment goods, and office supplies are some of the winning sectors in the Canadian economy, in large part due to work from home and social distancing directives. As we can see, unfortunately, for the sectors that are experiencing the largest drop, it is no surprise that transportation-related goods have taken a huge hit as travel has been significantly limited. Entertainment, and that is more external entertainment, movie theaters and so forth, and apparel are another few sectors that are likely and will continue to struggle into 2020, the rest of 2020. Apparel may have some reprieve, and apparel, footwear, and things of that nature may have some reprieve for some companies that are able to move online or are already online, but demand will certainly be curtailed as income and employment insecurity impact consumer choices. And so put simply, consumers spend either through their income earned or through credit. Newly available data from RBC now tracks how consumer spending is trending. And outside of necessities, we know that non-discretionary spending is dropping, and spending data demonstrates that debit and credit use fell by almost 40% in late March. So as information trickles out on exit strategies, phasing out restrictions, work from home directives, having longer timelines, there's a bit more certainty around what the next few months are going to look like. And so spending is starting to pick up as we ready ourselves for longer stays at home, but is still well below levels seen in early 2020 and will likely remain as such until later this year. And so why do we think it'll stay as such? Well, there's a fairly close correlation between the lowest paid workers and change in hours worked. And so we've seen some pretty big hits to employment, and that's no surprise, of course, but segments particularly based in the part-time hours or front-facing services will be some of the hardest hits. And they are also a very important and large proportion of our consumer base. And so putting this into context, we are facing one of the most challenging employment environments in our modern memory. We not only have limited access to many services, employment is taking a huge hit. Hours worked have dropped by about 30% between January and April compared to a benchmark of Q4 2019. And some have been able to maintain relatively small drops in hours worked, but inevitably there are sectors that are being hit by both restrictions and drops in demand. And so if there is limited demand, then inevitably supply follows that direction as well. And there are some distinctions between the strong, the resilient, and the struggling. And that comes through for Canadian companies and sectors that may be able to withstand better than others throughout this crisis. As noted, sectors linked to the services will be one of the worst hit segments, so especially entertainment, food, and recreational services. The drop in those services leads to declines in the goods industry. And so the hardship faced by the restaurant industry, for example, directly affects food producers, processors, logistics, etc. The interconnectedness of economies will lead to lasting effects for many suppliers. So one of the solutions offered by the government has been to provide funding support to businesses, and about 1/3 of companies have close to 1 to 3 months of liquidity on hand before needing to tap into new forms of financing. And my apologies, this is from our EDC's research panel done in mid-April, where we surveyed companies to get a sense of what their experience was like coming into this crisis and what we could expect moving forward. And so, as mentioned, about 1/3 would have very tight liquidity conditions going into this crisis. And micro and small companies that also tend to be the smaller services providers, restaurants, storefronts, salons, etc., will require financial support sooner rather than later. While the government is providing support, businesses may ask themselves how they can adjust their business, particularly if we'll be in a downturn for longer than expected. And so companies have had to shift either product offerings or expand into digital in order to keep up where the demand is highest. And so as part of our research panel, we also asked what the percentage was of companies that were able to fulfill their orders online or by the phone, avoiding an in-person contact. And over 50% surveyed were able to meet more than half of their sales, either through phone, online, or non-in-person. Though 38% can only do about 25% or less, and with 17% unable to do any of their sales online or through these other methods. And so while digital sale is not possible for all businesses due to their business model or their offerings, those that can will be able to keep some activity alive, and hopefully will make them withstand some of the loss throughout this crisis. Consumers have taken to localizing. excuse me, their purchases, supporting community businesses, for example. But when those needs cannot be met by close proximity or services offered within our close proximity, online purchases will try to make up the rest. And so different sectors will be able to fare better than others. Starting with those that may have a harder time, we believe that tourism, food, personal, and recreational services will be one of the hardest hits, followed by retail, oil, transportation, and manufacturing, particularly for transportation-related goods, will be struggling more than some others. On the upside, sectors related to required spending will perform better. So this is an opportunity, as I mentioned, for companies to shift into digital if possible. But now as some of the social restrictions are being relaxed, we may start to see a bit more on the retailing side as well to be able to withstand some of the losses. Now, what does this all mean for the outlook, and how will Canada's and the global economy perform? So back to my earlier caveat, large and significant support policy announcements are constantly coming in and varied by country. As we have all experienced, COVID-19 puts us into uncharted territories, and ultimately all sectors and countries will be affected and will be dependent on flattening the infection curve, as well as return to work policies and the removal of restriction policies. And so precision on exit strategies and economic consequences requires constant vigilance and incorporation into our outlook. And so EDC's Global Economic Outlook, released in May, will be one of many revisions our team has had to update to incorporate the current crisis that we're navigating, and certainly won't be the last. But as of May, EDC expects that global growth will fall by about 3.8%. Developed markets will be the hardest hit, falling collectively by 5.4% in 2020. And the US will not tumble as much as most OECD markets, but will still fall by about 4.6%. The United Kingdom and France will be the hardest hit, falling by 7.1% and 8.3% respectively. And the first quarter's significant drop showed us just that same trend here in Canada. Adding to the storm is, of course, the devastation felt by the oil industry. While the economy will be supported by monetary and financial measures until growth resumes, weak commodity prices will be a drag on our currency. And all these pieces combined leads us to a Canadian GDP of minus 9.3% in 2020. Emerging markets, quickly on that, will benefit from higher and current and potential growth going into this crisis. They will seem like a much better story, but they will experience similar economic and financial challenges, with more downside risks to poverty and food insecurity. Collectively, emerging market output will drop by about 2.8% this year, and China will sustain an unthinkable 2.5% plunge. And so putting that into perspective, we were expecting closer to 5.5% to 6% prior to this crisis really taking hold. We are expecting a recovery, however, in demand as social distancing and shutdown measures are relaxed going into the latter part of this year and taking hold in 2021. However, as mentioned, the breadth and speed of recovery will depend on exit strategies and potential for second waves. And supporting our outlook are a few key assumptions that the global policy response has and will continue to be at large scale, particularly for developed markets, aimed at expanding support to households and businesses. And while recovery scenarios are highly dependent on exit strategy, as you can see, there's a few scenarios here, we are able to deduce through high frequency data and policy assumptions that we are likely to experience experience a loss in overall growth and activity, leading to a gap between our pre-COVID growth trend and what we can expect now moving forward. And so that dotted black line there is what we would have expected pre-COVID, and the other scenarios are down below, ranging from the 4 scenarios here. So we are expecting, within our base case, we are expecting a rebound at the end of Q2, and slowing, that rebound will slow by the end of the year as a subset of restrictions remain in place. Demand slowly recovers and supply begins to ramp up to meet that slowing demand, or that growing demand, albeit at a slower pace than of course we were expecting in early 2020. Countries will be recovering at different paces in line with their phased rise in cases, and will be dependent on local policy. We surveyed our analysts covering major markets, and we are expecting that positive growth will resume by and large between Q3 and Q4, but certain markets will be in a recessionary environment into early 2021. This will have implications on Canada. As mentioned, Canada is heavily dependent on global trade, and while the US remains our top destination by far, our diversification efforts and trade growth potential will be vulnerable to markets facing a challenging outlook. And so while recovery will happen, key challenges that were already burgeoning before COVID-19 will bubble again. And so slow growth and low interest rates will be part of our outlook for some time. Questions around globalization, the merits, the vulnerabilities are resurfacing. We will see a rise in inequality, growing debt burdens, and concentration of wealth. And that may, and if it hasn't already in many markets, may lead to social unrest and political risks. Geopolitics, of course, won't be spared, and the US-China dynamics will face a rough road ahead. And so to close, the global outlook in 2020 will be challenging. The crisis we are living through is unprecedented, and it will cause complex impacts. No country or sector will be spared, but some will face a more challenging outlook ahead. Those that have been able to pivot will have had built up some financial buffers, were larger in size, and have an agile digital presence. The uncertainty will remain as we navigate through exit and recovery strategy, but there is a recovery ahead. And so thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope that my presentation has provided a useful contextualization of what is happening and what we can expect moving forward. There is a Q&A available here if you type in your questions, and I see that there are a number that are already coming in. So please input your questions if you have them, and I look forward to them. So I will take a quick look at see what we have. And so we do have a question on what are some of the sectors that might actually see a boom following COVID-19, and are there any such suggestions for Canada in Q3, Q4, maybe in 2021, that will help smaller agile startups to position ourselves. And so I think what we're really seeing, as I mentioned earlier, businesses have been very quick and agile to start shifting some of their product offerings and looking at what are consumers asking for and how they can meet that, and particularly through online sources. And so local businesses have done very well. And if I take, Ottawa as a microcosm of an example of looking at what are some of the trends in purchases. And so in the food services, in shifting and being able to take online orders and things of that nature. But I think consumers are inevitably going to change their consumer patterns. Food is going to be an important proportion of that. I think there are some discussions, as I'm sure in many parts of the industry, of how to localize the food industry. industry? And how do we take advantage of this opportunity of, while not entirely moving away from globalization, because I think that our supply chains do require that for cost management, but how do we then meet the needs of our customers locally? And I think we're starting to see that in some areas, particularly if taking, local produce and creating processed food, for example. And so the food industry is certainly going to be one as well. Online services, and so we'll take gaming, movie streaming, anything along the lines of entertainment online, I think are going to be some important sectors to watch out for. But I think most of the industries that are going to do well are going to be able to follow the data trends from consumer spending. And so I strongly encourage you to look at the data and reach out to partners like ourselves, or even to services like ourselves, where we can navigate. And if you reach out to our website, we've had a number of sector specific reports that provide a better sense of what we can expect moving forward. But there are definitely going to be some sectors that are going to be doing quite well. As I mentioned, those that can offer online services or goods. The food industry is going to be one of them as well. And of course, as everyone is ramping up for working from home, any office supply related is certainly going to be one area where we can where Canadian companies can benefit from. And so taking a look here, and so there is a question around a second wave of COVID-19 in North America or India were predicted, or other regions, and how do other regions factor into this? And so, of course, I'm not an epidemiologist, but from what within our base case, we're maybe redefining the word second wave, or wave, that is. I think it's inevitable as we start to reduce some of our restrictions, that there will be an up and down of cases. And so we wouldn't necessarily characterize it as a second wave, but there are going to be some starts and stops. And I think that local policy is going to be very important. What we're seeing in some of the larger markets in the US, and if I take Brazil, for example, the second largest right now for cases, they're starting to regionalize and localize their approach to social distancing, to back to work directives, and reducing lockdowns, because every region is slightly different. And I think that's really going to help and make localization of those policies much more focused on what is the need of that local community, and much more agile. And so if there is, let's say, an increase in cases after a reopening, then there's a very quick curtailment of that, or trying to adjust. And so it is not part of our base case, as I mentioned, that we'll see a huge spike as is mostly known as the second wave, but we are likely to see some smaller waves of ups and downs going into the outlook. I think it's inevitable with something as unprecedented, and as we wait for medical research to move ahead and help us through this crisis. Any information on NAFTA 2.0, and so that is moving ahead. It is something that the implementation may face some challenges if we take the United States, for example, mainly because most policy right now is geared and focused on COVID-19 responses. But that is a great question, and I encourage you to check out our website, as we do stay up to date with specific trade negotiations. But I'm happy to provide a bit more information offline as well. Unfortunately, I don't cover trade agreements, but we do expect that to move forward. We do expect implementation to be likely a bit slower, mainly because most policy is very much geared towards addressing COVID-19. And so the last question we have here is how do we reconcile or make sense of the US stock market back to pre-COVID highs, yet 41 million people are unemployed. Buffett is on one side of the line, and nearly all cash and limited investments. Seems the worst is yet to come. I think that's a very good question because, as I mentioned, there is likely to see an increase in inequality. There are major challenges, particularly on the employment side, and this is where public policy is going to be paramount to how economies are able to withstand these shocks. As I mentioned, for those that are more in part-time work, precarious work, front-facing work are the first ones to face employment challenges and a reduction in income, higher unemployment. And this is where the government steps in with programs either through cash transfers, and that's what the US, the approach the US took. And so cash transfers to go directly into the pockets of individuals to try and keep them, afloat. There are a variety of different initiatives, such as with respect to to housing, and the inability, for example, to evict. And so all of these measures are coming into place. I think the more challenging is reaching the most vulnerable and those that may not be as connected into the economy or let's say the social benefit system. But there are efforts being made to that. It is going to be a challenge. I don't pretend to rosy the picture for those that will be facing unemployment. We are starting to see some improvements in data on the employment side, but it will be a rough road ahead. And linking that back to U.S. stock markets and the amount of funding that's happening, companies are taking advantage of the very low interest rates, as are governments, and so there is a lot of refinancing that's happening, a lot of reduction of cost to hopefully, if those costs are reduced, to hopefully help support the business and withstand this crisis as we manage through. And so with that, I will close. And again, I thank you very much for your time. And I encourage you to join the next session. And so that our next panel will be with Mark Button on how to adapt when the world is changing. With all that, enjoy the rest of the conference. Happy Pride, and great to meet you all.